Good morning, everyone. It is really my privilege to introduce Matthias Urban. He's the Desmond Chair of Early Childhood Education and Director of the Early Childhood Research Centre at Dublin University in Ireland. Matthias has a well-established track record of publications, I think many of you might have read, in international peer-reviewed journals. His work has been classified as world-leading and internationally excellent in the context of Research Excellence Framework in the United Kingdom. He has been awarded the Marion Block Distinguished Career Award by the International Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Network in 2018, and the Dublin University President's Research Impact Award in 2010. Matthias was the lead author of the T20 G20. You might have heard yesterday, you may recall, from the presentation from Brett from EGDAN. He's developed the policy briefs on early childhood development, education, and care in 2018 when it was held in Argentina, 2020 in Saudi Arabia, 2021 in Italy, and 2022 Indonesia. And the next one, I suppose, he will be present there again. And he's a member of the European Commission Expert Working Group on Early Childhood Education and Care under the leadership of Géraldine Libraud. We are very happy to have her here and other members in the working group at the European Commission. Through his research and advocacy work, he's one of the voices at the global and the regional level that calls for early childhood system as a public good, and for a holistic, integrated approach that makes justice to every child's rights in the context where they live. At the same time, he's been challenging the business as usual narrative in early childhood field and disrupted it with standpoints that many times pointed to critical and political discussions that need to be held. Be realistic, demand the impossible. Right, Matthias? Please welcome on the scene.
Now, good morning. Wonderful to see everybody in this room. It's been a while since the last ISA conference, so we're all still here. It takes a village. It takes an ecosystem for each and every child to thrive, is the theme of the conference. And I thought it can really be boiled down to this sort of, this kind of apocryphal saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Early childhood as a global common good. I have a few thoughts I would like to share with you this morning, and we'll see how it goes. So, yes, there is this kind of overused proverb of uncertain origin. It's been used by a lot of people, including Hillary Clinton, who wrote a book about it some years ago. But I'm suggesting that we shouldn't use this image of the village to romanticize childhood, to lament the loss of the good old days, because were they that good, really? But we should take it as a starting point, a point of exploration of the complexities, the contradictions, the challenges, and the possibilities of the support systems for children and families and communities in our day and time, in our societies, in our complex world. What makes a village in our times? How do we envisage community? I'm going to start taking a step back in terms of what are we talking about, early childhood education. And I'm going to offer you a definition of education in general that I took from someone who's influenced my thinking quite a bit. An Austrian psychoanalyst, Siegfried Bernfeld, who in 1925 in his book Sisyphus, or the Limits of Education, offered this definition. He said, education is the sum total of societal reaction to the fact of ontogenetic development. That's a bit of a mouthful. But I think it's important, because what he says in this big, heavy sentence, Austrian psychoanalysts, and that's what they do, it's a very wide-ranging definition that has implications for us as we try and attempt to reimagine education for all and early childhood education for all in the 21st century. Because it means education begins at birth. It's the reaction to ontogenetic development, the fact that babies are born and then develop. It means that education is much more than schooling, because it's the sum total of what we as a society, how we engage with, how we relate to young children. And of course, it's profoundly political. It's the societal reaction. That means there are interests, positions, contradictions, struggles about how to do all this. Siegfried Bernfeld, it has to be said, was, as I mentioned that, a psychoanalyst. He was also a left-wing Zionist, very much engaged in the movement to set up, well, the left-wing kibbutzim movement from Europe into Israel. And of course, in this day and age, you can't quote a left-wing Zionist without reminding ourselves that one person's dream easily becomes another person's hell, as we can see now. So this utopia leads to this reality in Gaza and in the West Bank at the moment. And I would just recommend, as a sort of a little thing to do after this presentation, for instance, to read Arich Zabakauri's really fascinating book that documents the role of left-wing movements in the colonization of Palestine. But let's do something completely different now. This is 1964, Bob Dylan. Some may remember him singing, "The times they are a-changing. Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit the waters around you have grown. Accept that it's soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming, or you'll sink like a stone. For the times, they are a-changing." 1964, time of profound societal change, upheaval, and sort of prophetic protest song about this. Fast forward to the 21st century, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. A fairly recent report about childcare services in New York City. And the report states that up to 80%, you can see it here, of what they call licensed services in New York City are at risk of flooding caused by rising sea levels. And the report states that climate change and childcare can feel like two disparate issues, but they are not anymore. We cannot effectively respond to a chaotic climate without investing in the early years, states this report. You better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. I'm offering this because I think it's an important vantage point for our thinking about where we are in this as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century. We're living science fiction. This is sort of... because I think what it tells us is not what some people refer to as the polycrisis of climate, loss of biodiversity, forced mass migration, violence, war, poverty, that all this isn't happening somewhere safely far away. It's happening around us. And in a way, the coastlines of Bangladesh and New York are blurred and morphing. We're dealing with very similar issues, and we better start having conversations about how to do that. So, as I said, People talk about what they call the polycrisis. Edgar Morin, some years ago, called it a complex intersolidarity of problems, crises, uncontrolled processes, and the general crisis of the planet. And you see some of those terms here, put them into one of these little machines where you put keywords in and it comes out in a word cloud. And of course, all this has immense impacts on young children and their families and communities, and you know this from your work and your practice so much better than I do. So where do we go from here? Clearly not back. We can't return to what we think might be normal, because, as you probably know from your practice as well, normal was and is the problem quite often in the first place. So, how can we reframe this? Here's another dead philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, who wrote about liminal times and the times they are changing in a way in his sort of a perspective in Italy in the 1920s. The old world falling apart, the new world kind of scary-ish appearing on the horizon. And he says the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Sound familiar? Could be sort of a description of a lot of things we witness in our world. So I suppose we are living liminal times. But I'm concerned that in education, the sum total of societal reaction, remember Siegfried Bernfeld, we seem to be stuck quite often in 20th century, in a time loop really. The things that we take for granted, education and its colonial impositions, its addiction to unlimited growth in the 20th century thinking, its naive belief in progress, that's the only way forward. Can we imagine instead, in this room together as a community, a right to an education that is about transformation, that's about justice, that is about survival? And can we have these conversations? So, again, looking at the crisis, what we've seen, and this is sort of some first conclusions drawn from experiences, not least from the COVID-19 pandemic. What we've seen is that despite very significant differences of early childhood systems between countries and regions, and you represent that in this room, very similar issues are emerging, and early childhood education has become, to borrow Bruno Latour's term, a matter of concern in both the global south and the global north. And we have to come back to this and reflect on whether these distinctions between south and north actually make sense anymore. I think it raises very urgent questions about the future directions of policy, of practice, and of research in this field. And we have all three areas in this room as well, so it's ideal for a conversation. And how to overcome the still persistent certainties and paradigms in our field. And I mean the paradigm of the universal individual child and its development that happens sort of somewhere disconnected. The paradigm of decontextualized knowledge and its creation, somewhere in the ivory tower in the university, I'm guilty as charged. The paradigm of simplistic measurement and comparison. And of course, the paradigm and the naivety of the belief in policies and practices as tools that can solve very distinct social problems, this one and that one, by distinct professions and academic disciplines. You do this, we do that, you do that. So some first conclusions at this stage. I suppose we're in a situation where we can say that existential crises for humanity are no longer the exception. They have become a new normal for humanity. And that's a starting point. Children are the silent victims of the crisis, and this is taken from a recent UNICEF report. And in consequence, terms like and concepts like resilience, survival, equity, justice, peace, I suggest are the concepts that will have to be at the very center of our discussion about early childhood development, education and care as we move and plan and think about the decades ahead. And it also is becoming much clearer that this applies to both individual programs, what we do with children on a weekday morning in our program, and services, but also at systems level, at policy level. Resilient early childhood systems require, and we know that now, there's plenty of evidence, require multi-sectoral policies based on a universal right to education for all children from birth. Resilience, let's talk about that for a moment. This is Save the Children data from earlier this year, from summer 24. Save the Children documenting that up to 21,000 children estimated to be missing in Gaza, presumed dead beneath the rubble, killed by Israel, harmed beyond recognition by Israeli explosives, buried in unmarked graves, detained or abducted by Israel. So that's from Save the Children. You could look it up on their website. In this context, what does it mean to talk about resilience? It's a bit of a term at the moment. Programs talk about promoting, creating, supporting resilience. Resilience has become a learning outcome in many sort of frameworks. Resilience, I looked it up in the dictionary. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, means the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. Is this what we're talking about? The capacity to recover from atrocities? I suppose, and here we're moving into Siegfried Bernfeld's third space, the political space, as we witness the killing of children, fostering resilience in early childhood education, as noble as it may be, without fighting for justice, becomes ethically impossible. It's an imperative that I think is really important for us going forward. So, some other fields of tension that might frame our thinking. Here are two quotes from two fairly recent reports talking about the state of affairs in early childhood. The first one says, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the deep inadequacies in the current system of childcare provision, including uneven access, poor quality, the need for public finance, poor terms of employment for the workforce, and the overall vulnerability of the sector. This is not from an ISA publication. This is a report published by the World Bank. One of the key players in early childhood development, mainly in the global south, in terms of setting the context, providing resources. This is their analysis. The second quote is from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in 2021, stating, discontent is rising around the world, reflecting dysfunctions and injustices that have emerged in economic, social, and political systems. It's also a response to the damage that humankind is inflicting on the world's natural systems and thus inevitably upon itself. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed these defects to devastating effect. It hasn't created inequalities, but it has shone a light on them. But there are slivers of hope in these reports. The OECD report continues to state, as countries plan their recovery from the multiple crises triggered by the pandemic, they have an opportunity to make these systems more inclusive, more sustainable, more resilient, here's the word again, and more responsive. But they conclude this can only happen with the active participation of citizens in new forms of collective action at the local, national, and international level. And this is where you come into the picture, with your organizations and programs and networks, both feet on the ground, but connecting globally. That's the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, stating this. Looking at it from sort of a grassroots level, you could frame it in a slightly different way. This is from a text talking about grassroots initiatives globally. Esteva and Prakash writing this beautiful book about grassroots postmodernism. The way they frame it is, they say, an epic is unfolding at the grassroots, walked, marched, danced by common women and men whose lives depend on the strength and the creativity of their feet, hands, and noses. An epic is unfolding at the grassroots. Commoners are affirming themselves, resisting the domination of the corporations that rule the world, freeing their hopes and dreams from global blueprints concocted in an anesthetized labs of elite think tanks. So there's a slightly different perspective, but talking about the very same thing, really. Their beautiful tapestry is being painted and spoken in diverse hues and tongues, moving stories of how peoples of all races, cultures, and traditions are creatively regenerating their places, their cultures, and their traditions. And I am aware that there's a session happening here, or has happened, about the importance of place in early childhood education. So, what can we learn from all this? We are in an environment, when it comes to early childhood development, early childhood education and care, where there's a lot of unfinished business. We have a lot to do, but it's also a story of success over the past 10, 15, 20 years in terms of access to much higher quality services for young children. It has been an unequal picture, has played out differently in different regions of the world, and you can look up the figures. But there is also a shift towards much more comprehensive integration of services, incorporating nutrition, health, well-being, education, care, social cohesion, equality in many countries. Around 80 countries in this world have already adopted integrated early childhood policy frameworks. Mainly coming from regions in the global south, it has to be said. It is a thinking that only begins to filter into the European and North American debate. So what can we learn with countries that have already made these experiences? The European Union says there is a really important role for early childhood, because early childhood education and care is something to tackle inequality, exclusion, poverty. Early childhood education and care, says a very high-level policy document coming out of the Council of the European Union. Early childhood education and care needs to be part of an integrated child's rights-based package of policy measures to improve outcomes for children and break intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. Well, we're all for that, aren't we? So how do we break intergenerational cycles of disadvantage? Maybe we could start by recognizing that those intergenerational cycles of disadvantage are a direct consequence of persistent intergenerational and global cycles of unfair advantage. The two belong together. We might also in this room, without telling anybody, we can keep this in this room, challenge the myth of quality as the solution to everything. stop treating early child education as a panacea for fixing social problems caused by dysfunctional global exploitative economic systems. Our existing economic and social models, I think that has become pretty clear, are built on inequality. They are designed to create inequality and to maintain it. So how do we challenge that in our practices, in our thinking, in our policies, in our whatever we do in early childhood? We have to recognize early childhood education as a profoundly political and ethical project that addresses injustices and inequality at individual, collective, and systemic levels. And we have to connect, and you do this already, questions of social and environmental justice, of local and global justice. But we have to really be careful not to fall back into the trap of the panacea myth. Set up an early childhood program, everything will be fine. It won't. So that brings us to this dichotomy between the global south and the global north. Where exactly is the global south? Can you pinpoint it on a map? More and more global south thinkers and theorists, authors and activists and advocates say actually global south and north are not geographical concepts. It's a frame of thinking rather. It's a possible epistemology that enables us to fundamentally question this separate Eurocentric colonialist thinking from other ways of knowing and being and doing in the world. And that brings us to how can we connect our ways of knowing and being and doing in the world. And here's some suggestions or some experiences from colleagues who write and work and think in the so-called Global South. This is a group around a group of colleagues, international authors around a colleague from Botswana, Seto Pong, who sadly passed away this year. They talk about their experience of when they write about their work and try to publish their academic work, they talk about something, an experience of what they call epistemic exclusion. They feel excluded from the sort of dominant the machine of knowledge production. And they say our experience is one of exclusion of existing, accessible, and highly relevant majority world research from the dominant academic discourses. But it's also something that doesn't only apply to experience in Botswana. It's not simply a matter of disregarding majority world research. It's also, and brings it back into this room, it's also about ignoring research that doesn't readily fit into a predefined epistemic framework consisting of a set of measures, constructs, theories derived from minority world thinking. They talk about things, for instance, that in developmental psychology, quite often studies and samples suffer from what they call a weird bias. The group of children is weird. White, educated, industrialized, and so on. So it is actually representing a very powerful maintenance mechanism of minority world biases, and we have to challenge that. And we have to challenge that we still have monuments that cherish Christopher Columbus as an explorer, a visionary, and a naturalist. I knew a lot of things about Christopher Columbus, but I didn't realize he was a naturalist as well. Anyway, bringing it back to our discussion, to a critical discussion, there is something that I think we've been promoting quite a bit in various forms. And just one example, you will be familiar with the nurturing care framework. This is what our colleagues in this international group have to say about this. They say, one thing about the nurturing care framework, and I don't want to put the finger on this, it's one example of many in terms of the epistemic exclusion. While it is a roadmap, a very important roadmap for global implementation of ECD programs, it focuses on the majority world, where the children are. But the question is, has the underlying evidence been produced overwhelmingly in the minority world? What does that thinking come from? And Setopong and Scheidegger and others sort of in this group, they say in their analysis, this model suggests that caregivers of deprived toddlers have shortcomings because of their own upbringing. It implies that most people in low and middle income countries, and almost all Chadians, so that's their example, the country of Chad, are cognitively and socio-emotionally deficient. And they go on, why might that be? They say, such evidence might make an effective appeal to well-intended individuals and institutions in high-income countries to invest in early childhood development. We need more investment in early childhood development, but it also serves to promote negative stereotypes about low and middle-income countries in contexts and populations and resembles white saviorism. It's a position. It's a start of a conversation that we need to have. Right. Can we move from epistemic exclusion to new alliances, to building what some people now call epistemological allyship, which is about an active practice, a consistent and challenging practice of unlearning, reevaluating, where we, as people of privilege, seek to work in solidarity with marginalized groups. But that's not something that is sort of, we can just put on our lapel here and say, actually, I'm an ally. It's a process. It's a lifelong building of relationships. And it's not something that we can do by ourselves. I can't identify myself as an ally. It has to be recognized by those you are seeking to ally with. Again, there's the relationship and the conversation. Bringing us to another very important concept when we think about our programs, solidarity. Here's Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan author, who says, unlike solidarity, which is horizontal, is exercised as equals, charity is practiced from the top down, humiliates those who receive it, and never alters power relations even a little. In the best of cases ever. There will be justice, but in high heaven. Here on earth, charity does not disturb injustice, it only intends to hide it. Another starting point for a critical conversation about how we frame the things that we find important. Building new alliances, trying to sort of bring this together, and coming into the wrapping up phase of this presentation, building new alliances across onto epistemological divides. We had the Global South, we had this sort of thinking about the Western-centric, Eurocentric, in a way, Cartesian divide between nature and culture and body and nature. And here too, indigenous authors, Maori authors, Alison Jones and Te Kahewa Hoskins writing, saying indigenous ontologies never had a nature-culture dualism. They never truly differentiated nature and culture. So we didn't do the Descartes thing saying, here's the thinking, here's the... But then there is the guy who invented kindergarten, Friedrich Froebel, writing in 1828. When he's at play, we have to do a bit of gender realignment here. In in 1828, he wrote, "When he's at play, a child talks continuously," thus indicating that with him, again, talking is not yet distinguished from himself as the talker, nor names from the things named. Play and speech are the elements in which the child now lives. So he attributes the same life to all about him: the pebble, the chip of wood, the plant, the flower, the animal. Each and all can hear and feel and speak. Indigenous ontologies never had a nature-culture dualism. There is a conversation to be had, and there is also some reclaiming to do about the very roots of our profession, of our thinking, of our discipline. It's important to say that at that time, when he wrote this, Friedrich Froebel, he didn't write it in a university or in sort of some vacuum. He wrote it in a time of profound social upheaval. The times, they are changing. People were marching on the streets, people were demanding rights, people were fighting, taking up armed struggle to stage a revolution, to try and install the first democratic republic in continental Europe. That didn't go very far, didn't go well. And when the revolution finally collapsed, one of the first things that happened afterwards, when the Prussian state in Germany took over and basically they banned Froebel's kindergarten. They did not ban working with young children. They specifically banned Froebel's kindergarten because it was atheist, socialist, and outright dangerous. The idea that you could have early education for everybody, that was really dangerous. The idea that you would have to do this with highly qualified, professionalized women, that was revolutionary. And the idea that this was a common good, something that could be done and thought and organized outside of the church and outside of the state, that was really bad. So it had to be banned. I think we have to reclaim this. Early childhood education and care is dangerous. Yes, let's do that. Okay, so where are we in the 21st century? What's happening in terms of hope? Here are three frameworks coming together that I think should inform our thinking much more as we move forward. You will be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goal Framework, 2030 SDGs. You will be familiar with SDG 4 and Target 4.2, where it says by 2030, every boy and girl to have access to a high-quality early childhood program, 1 year of pre-primary. But it's really important, and many of you are already doing this, to understand that early childhood is not just about realizing 4.2, but that early childhood is actually the enabler for achieving the entire framework, all of the goals. There's a second document that's quite important but not talked about enough. It's called the Abidjan Principles, where the signatories have come together to state that there is the need to prioritize public over private education from birth. States must provide free public education of the highest attainable quality to everyone within their jurisdiction as effectively and as expeditiously as possible to the maximum of their available resources. What does that mean? It means that a country like Sierra Leone, which clearly isn't a high-income country, has now introduced free education from early childhood right through to the end of secondary education. If Sierra Leone can do it, others can do it as well. And there is, of course, the fairly recent Tashkent Declaration and commitments to action, not program for action, actual commitments to action, adopted by the UNESCO World Conference on Early Childhood Care and Education in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, at the end of 22. Stating education as a right to education and care, from birth, stating the importance of whole-of-government, multi-sectoral and integrated policy development, of provision and coordination, and stating the importance of solid finance and resourcing. So these three documents are framing a sort of global policy environment that lets me think there is hope for development. And one thing that sort of follows on this, and this is fairly recent, this is just this summer, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child adopted this motion at their session in Geneva, where they basically gave a mandate to form an intergenerational working group of governments to look into a new legal instrument that would sort of add to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and for the first time enshrine the right to early childhood education in international law, and also the right to free secondary education, because both are missing from the UN Convention. This is going to be a very slow process, but it has started, and I think it's hugely important. And it's not just talking about let's do 1 year of pre-primary, what many countries do, but it talks about education and care from birth. This is the direction of travel. So, but all of this is not just a technical question. It is an ethical and a political project. If we fill all these declarations with meaning, if we want to realize the Abidjan principles, it's much more than a technical task. It's an ethical project, it's a political project that requires a shift in culture, in commitment to early childhood education from birth and the global common good. And it will require, as an ethical and political project, much wider engagement with communities and a wide range of stakeholders, many of them represented in this room already, including local leaders, teachers, and all those working in early childhood in their formal and informal roles, because not all of us are teachers or educators. So, to conclude, those of you who know me know that I can't end the presentation without a quote by Paulo Freire, talking about hope. And actually, I think he's talking about you. My discourse in favor of dreaming, of utopia, of freedom, of democracy is the discourse of those who refuse to settle and do not allow the taste for being human, which fatalism deteriorates, to die within themselves. Let's change the discourse. Thank you very much.